So welcome again to the penultimate seminar for the Unidee 2020 programme. It's really good to see everyone who's able to make it today. And I think we've had quite a lot of communication in the last couple of weeks. Feels like they're kind of like a few more emails going out, a few more one-to-ones. So I'm kind of feeling quite connected with most of you, but it's good to see those people that we've not had direct communication with for a bit as well. So today, I mean, it's the same format as you're probably used to seeing, but we have Professor Mick Wilson with us for Valand Academy. I'm really happy to have him here. It's like a very inspirational thinker and writer for me, so it's great to have him as part of the programme, and I'll give him a proper introduction in a few minutes. The schedule, the format is you're probably quite familiar with this for now, but here it is anyway, just for the avoidance of doubt. So yeah, we'll have the presentation and time for questions and answers with Mick afterwards, a bit of sort of chat. Hopefully you've sort of had a chance to have a look over the sort of preliminary reading that Mick sent out. Remind me who wrote that again, Mick, because I didn't send it out with the...
I'm going to have to check.
Mick's going to, Mick will kind of find out where the text came shortly. But yeah, you've had a bit of background.
I should have sent the reference with it. Sorry.
It's from the Art and Politics reader, wasn't it? So we're going to, we'll have the presentation and the conversation with Mick afterwards. If you can use the chat for any questions, feel free to put those through whilst Mick's presenting as usual, and that means that we can sort of be gathering those up and answer them all together. Then we will aim to have a break because it's nice to do that. And a group discussion from 3:30 to 4:20 with some prompts that Mick's put together, which are kind of will follow on from some of the themes that he's bringing up. But just to give you a bit of a heads up, we're sort of thinking about the role of exhibitions within the types of practices that we're exploring through the residency. So that group discussion will give you a bit of chance to think about that in terms of your own practice and other things that you might have come across. And then at the end, we'll hopefully have 10 minutes for me just to go through, do a programme update as normal, but that's going to be sort of focused on just me going through the final trace submissions and the rest of the schedule, because obviously this last week is going to look a little bit different, and we're asking you to sort of think about what trace you're leaving from the residency as a whole. So I'll go through that properly later on. So yeah, I think that's kind of, if everyone's happy with that as the schedule, then we can sort of crack on with Mick's presentation. We've got a decent amount of people all in here now. So yeah, I mean, you'll have had Mick's biographical information as well, so you can sort of, I always feel weird about just sort of reading those out, but I would say that I mean, I've connected with Mick previously through his work in Valand, but also as a sort of writer about these practices that we're exploring, and always bring something to the table that I think is very timely and pertinent, and sort of explains things that are often very complicated, but in a kind of in a way that makes them sort of resonate with me particularly, and I hope it will feel the same for you as well. So I'll pass on to Mick, and he can take the floor for the next sort of 45 minutes or so. And Mick, I'll butt in and give you a little countdown when we're sort of getting around that sort of into 40 minutes or so, just so you've got an idea there.
Perfect. Thanks for that, and thanks for the nice introduction. And sorry there, guys, for just blank for a moment there. The reading is an extract from chapter 1 of Conflictual Aesthetics, Artistic Activism and the Public Sphere, which is a book that came out last year by Oliver Marchart, who's a political theorist who's kind of moved into dealing with contemporary art. And the reason I gave that text out was just because I think it's short, and it kind of has this very encapsulated account of a certain kind of set of cliches that structure discussions in the contemporary art world around notions of art and politics. There's always this kind of dichotomy, is it art or politics? Art, by not being political, is political, etc. And it's not it's not so much to rush head on into those debates, but rather to try and avoid getting sucked into the way in which the standard dichotomy is set up. So that was my thought with that reading. But if you have any questions on it, I'd be happy to try and respond, or if you have any comments, those would be welcome as well. And I'll put the actual reference into the chat window later. So on the screen, you see what I'm hoping to go through in the next 45 minutes or so. So I'm just going to start by talking about some current research interests to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And then I want to introduce this kind of question of the exhibition as a kind of contested site or object at this moment in time. And then I want to look at what I'm describing as kind of tensions in how questions of extended exhibition and questions of, you know, durational practices, research practices, what's been called the social turn, how those kind of practices that in some way operate in terms other than exhibition and yet are also relayed in exhibition. And so some of the tensions that emerge there. And I think this is not just to do with socially embedded practices or socially engaged practices, but it also pertains to a whole range of other kinds of research practices and practices that operate in different temporalities, like 10-year, 20-year undertakings, or indeed lifetime projects. And then I was hoping to kind of lead into some questions to the group. So, so this is just a list of some of the things that I've been interested in and working with over the last few years. So I have a particular preoccupation with questions of food, and food as a kind of space of both the everyday, but also a space of a kind of aesthetics that isn't simply the question of elite culture. And then in another strand of interest, I'm looking at the question of death and how it operates as part of how we imagine the political. And a particular issue is the question of the different ways in which the dead are given or not given a part within our political kind of imagination, our sense of who we are with in the world. And then kind of overlapping with those is an interest in rhetoric, just particularly notions of voice and modes of address and persuasion. So that's something that kind of bridges theoretical work as well as practical work. And then, of course, kind of a major preoccupation is the question of art and educational processes that operate as what I call applied experiments in political imagining. And that will kind of show up in some of the projects I talk about a little bit later. And then I have an interest in questions of the curatorial. So those are my interests, but, you know, what do I actually do? I would say I spend the majority of my time teaching, but I also write, I edit, I make, and I'm involved in some organizational work. And typically, all of this is stuff I do with other people. It's not like I write books or stuff like that. I co-edit them with others. And so in terms of my teaching, I'm involved in lots of different things. This is one of my pet projects, which is every summer I do a course in art and politics, which is based on the attempt to try and overcome that kind of dichotomy that I spoke about at the start in relation to Oliver Marchard's reading. These are some books that I've worked on with Paul O'Neill, who spoke at the very start of the series. These are some more recent books with Paul and Lucy Steeds, and the last one, Curating After the Global, with Simon Shake. And this is another book that I was involved in with some colleagues here in Sweden, which was looking at this particular project in the suburbs of Stockholm, which dealt with questions of segregation in the most segregated along class and color lines suburb of Sweden. So in terms of other activities, I've been involved in making a lot of food, and I'm not going to go into that today. I also, do works that involve singing, and I'm just going to bother you with a couple of minutes of singing just to make sure you're all awake. Gundaguduriot gonenter do holerantale Marienterna Arnaramlehu Tor doing in you Agas Madun Arvika Marawahmid of a Kona It's knowledge igau accessing all. So I'm not going to talk about stuff today. I just wanted to get a sense of the spread of what I do. And of course, another key thing I'm involved in is in lots of different forms of workshop. And earlier this summer, one of the workshops that I was involved in was this question under the heading Handfuls Thrown into Air and Scattered Over Earth, was this question about how exhibition is understood and what are the different kind of claims and counterclaims being made about how exhibition operates. And with a primary focus on the contemporary art system, but also paying attention to the fact that exhibiting an exhibition is not the exclusive prerogative of the art system. There's a whole spectrum of exhibitionary institutions, from ethnographic museums through to department stores and shopping centers and all other kind of institutions of display. So one of the things that was kind of haunting that workshop was the proposition that for all our familiarity with exhibition, that there's still somehow something unsettled in just being clear of what exactly an exhibition is. So there's this kind of super familiar institutional protocol, but then there's also a question about, well, what exactly is happening? And what are the dynamics and what, how does it come to generate meaning? Now, I'm pointing here to two different kind of examples of the way in which this question has been tackled at the moment. So this book that came out last year from Tristan Garcia and Vincent Lamont, Theatre Garden Beastry, A Materialist History of Exhibition, where they deal with exhibition as a general kind of epistemic protocol, a general kind of instrument of knowledge production, not just in relation to art situations, but in a much more broadened kind of perspective and as a kind of analytic of modernity. So, and then contrasting that, the work of the After All Exhibition Histories group, where they've produced over the last decade, I think it's 11 or 12 volumes now that deal with specific exhibitions subject to this kind of multiple lens, looking at it in a kind of kaleidoscopic way. And a really interesting example of this is the one where they looked at the Mary Jane Jacob Culture in Action project from 1993 in Chicago as a kind of case study in the question of exhibition in relation to notions of the social intervention, social practice. So obviously, this question of exhibition has kind of received a new inflection within the context of the pandemic. And so this is taken from the MoMA website sometime back in April, May, when many institutions underwent this kind of dramatic repackaging and reformatting of their exhibitionary tactics into the online spaces of the internet. And you got a whole range of things from you know, you could fly through the exhibition in a virtual reality app, or you have a video doing a walk through a guided tour, or you simply have a kind of slideshow or a PDF or whatever. But it was very interesting that in spite of a background of kind of wide kind of critical reflection on the nature of exhibition, in the moment of epidemic, there was a sudden rush to just move everything online and push it out. And there was a sense that for all the rhetorics about the dynamics of exhibition, making publicness, etc., etc., suddenly it was just like pile them high, sell them cheap. You know, there was a kind of public relations thing of just get it up, get it onto the screen and get it out there. And while not every institution kind of rushed at it, there was definitely a kind of a feeling of just, you know, let's go online and let's get there quickly. And of course, this overlapped and entwined with this other moment where for about a decade, we had this increased visibility of both forms of state violence and forms of resistance to state violence through various social media platforms. And you get this kind of strange situation where MoMA, an institution notorious in terms of its lack of a progressive racial politic, and suddenly announcing itself as being on the side of the protests in the street. And I mean, I don't want to propose a cynicism here, but it's just, you're clearly just something strange happening that we can't just take this at face value. But there's a kind of a moment where things are rushing online, and at the same time, this has been inflected by a particular form of kind of signaling values, signaling positions, signaling alignments. And of course, it's very easy to put something on a website. It's a little more difficult to live the claim that you post. But anyway, it's just to get a sense of a particular moment where there's a constellation of forces manifesting in this kind of rush online. And I just mentioned this one project, which came out of the International Consortium. And International Consortium is a network of museums, Reina Sofia, Van Abbe, Muke in Antwerp, Galeria Moderna in Ljubljana, Gallery of Contemporary Art in Warsaw, and SALT in Istanbul, and MACBA in Barcelona. And this network of museums came up with the strategy of inviting artists to generate content to be distributed online. And part of the rationale was thinking, well, in the pandemic with lockdown, how do we commission artists? How do we kind of enable them to make work, but also, you know, that we can pay people to do stuff. So there was a quick move to kind of set up this Instagram protocol and 16 artists commissioned to produce work. And there was a kind of a point of departure, which was this famous piece by Ivakovic, you know, a piece that's kind of become, in a sense, emblematic of the kind of critical art cultures of former Yugoslavia, going back to the 60s and 70s. So this is a kind of, you know, classic work, and the reference to that work triggered a kind of a critical response that was quite interesting. I just jumped it here. Yeah, sorry. I didn't include the quote, but basically there was a strong reaction critically to this piece in terms of the museums kind of laying a claim to being the agents of a critical, resistant, subversive culture. And there was a kind of a strong critical reaction. Jörg Heiser's Artists in Quarantine, Public Intellectuals and the Trouble with Empty Heroics. I mean, the title kind of gives you the nub of the critique. Another aspect of the critical response to this move by institutions to transfer exhibitionary protocols into online display was the observation that Google Arts and Culture was making this kind of grand move to establish itself as the kind of owner of a kind of global archive of art and culture. And so the sense that there was a kind of an enclosure being constructed on a global level in relation to heritage. And again, I just wanted to pick up here. So these are some frames from the kind of the about and the homepage of Google Art and Culture from April, May. And you see that, you know, Greek statuary, Nelson Mandela, the Van Gogh sunflowers. And then on the about page, we have these images, learning from the past to inspire the future, looking back at the civil rights movement. And a kind of, I mean, Google signaling a progressive social cultural agenda while enacting a process of enclosure. And the way in which the digitization of a cultural heritage and distribution systems kind of creating a radically new situation, and that somehow this rush to just place content online was maybe not really paying attention to what's going on in terms of the digitization of social relation. And of course, we might think of this in terms of the way in which, say, something like Art Forum, which in the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s operated as the kind of a kind of an exemplary central producer of reputation and visibility within international art systems, even with its New York kind of East Coast America focus. And then eFlux displacing that in some sense. So eFlux is now, I would suggest, the most central kind of network of visibility and a key infrastructure of reputation in terms of contemporary art system. And so we have, what I'm getting at here is that to think the question of exhibition is not a kind of timeless action of finding the essence of exhibition. It's a question of thinking it as something that is historically variable, contingent, and shaped by a number of different things. And we can kind of see in kind of rapid, accelerated intensity in this year, the way in which the terms of exhibition have been kind of renegotiated or rethought or reoperated within the context of the pandemic. And then I just throw in another dimension of this kind of puzzling over exhibition is recognizing that while on the one hand, within the discourses of contemporary art, there's a kind of well-established reflective critique of the white cube and how it operates, etc. But as Elena Filipovic in this brilliant essay pointed out several years ago, you know, we're also seeing the white cube become a global kind of norm. So through the massive expansion of the whole kind of Biennale system, and also the kind of franchising of kind of big name blue chip museums and a whole other set of developments, we see the white cube becoming installed as a kind of a global convention, a global protocol. And I just thought I'd reference this little moment in Adam Curtis's film Bitter Lake, where we have a clip of a teacher teaching a class in Afghanistan, and she's introducing the famous Duchamp urinal, and you know, she tells the class, "Well, I don't expect the ladies to know what I'm showing them. An artist called Marcel Duchamp put this toilet in an art gallery." And the point of Curtis's profiling this moment is pointing to the way in which a kind of notion of contemporary art as an index of kind of democratic societies, etc., is kind of bundled into a particular kind of process of propaganda and occupation in terms of the military occupation of Afghanistan. So we get something about the, there's something here that kind of signals to us something of the power relations in play with the global imposition of a particular set of protocols and a particular canonical history. But also there's something about the, this idea that the intervention of Duchamp in displaying the urinal still underlines something about the operation of exhibition as a mode of valorization of art as art. And this is something I'll come back to in a moment. So staying with this question of just the kind of the tensions within how the question of exhibition is considered, I want to point to a particular moment in the late 60s, early 70s, when in a number of different places, we have a kind of an attempt to re-engineer the conditions, particularly of the museum exhibition, but of the exhibition in general. And so you have the famous intervention by Robert Smith in the context of Documenta 5, talking about cultural confinement, which is about a critique of the kind of the mastery of the curator in, subjecting works to some kind of master vision, but also, and more importantly perhaps, this question of analyzing the museum in terms of its relationship to a whole set of other institutions of surveillance and control, asylums, jails, etc. And of course, there's a kind of an echo here of Tony Bennett's analysis in the 90s, an anticipation of Tony Bennett's analysis in the 1990s about how the 19th century European museum emerges as a kind of apparatus to train and discipline the bodies of viewers. Coming out of that kind of conceptual critique of the museum, we have this whole kind of tranche of work of institutional critique, and this famous kind of instance of it in Andrea Fraser's work, where she's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and she kind of enacts this docent role who kind of holds forth on the virtues of culture in the museum in this kind of exaggerated theatrical manner that is poking fun at the conceits of elite culture, etc. In the same moment of the late 60s through to the 80s, in different parts of the world, there are different versions of this attempt to re-engineer the museum's operation and re-engineer the terms of exhibition. This is a scene from a series of works from the early 1970s, a program called the Sundays of Creation that was organized through the education department of the Museum of Art in Rio. And Federico Moret was the kind of animating authorship behind this series, but essentially it involved gathering artists and lots of members of the public for these kind of assemblies around particular different materials. So over a series of Sundays, a kind of festival of activity and play with a different material was enacted. This attempt to, in some way, re-socialize the institution, to re-engineer the social relations that it produces, is something that we see emerging in many different places. So this other example from '68 and the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the model for a qualitative society, where the museum and the exhibition space becomes made over into this kind of invitation for activity and engagement and production, and becomes a kind of a playground. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that the question of the exhibition as a space that can both model and enact and even re-engineer social relations is something that already emerges within museological practice in the 1960s and 70s. And it does so in a number of different geopolitical locations. So this is not one singular manifestation, but something that's bubbling in different ways in different places. Nonetheless, in the wake of this, we still have this position whereby exhibition is still the primary mechanism through which contemporary art is kind of valorized as art. So while there's an absolute widespread recognition and acceptance that art can operate in a whole range of contexts and so forth beyond the gallery, beyond the museum, beyond the exhibition, I would suggest that exhibition still remains the key mechanism whereby art is valorized as art. And that, of course, creates a certain tension for practices that might not so easily manifest or operate within the terms of exhibition. And that's what I'm going to turn to now, is a series of practices that in different ways are trying to operate so that exhibition becomes one moment in the practice, but is not the defining moment. So in some sense, to operate with the exhibition, but to try and not have the exhibition operate as simply a valorization of values for the market, but to do something else. And these strategies I'm not presenting them as entirely successful or unproblematic. I'm presenting them as things to think with. So I begin with this Theaster Gates project, which is, I think, pretty well familiar at this stage, but I just think it's still worth addressing because of the particular strategy whereby Gates, in heavily segregated along color and class lines within his own neighborhood in Chicago, he purchases a building and then begins to renovate it. This is done in 2009, and then in 2011, he has an invitation to participate in Documenta 13. And so he finds a neglected, derelict building in Kassel, and his project becomes the rehabilitation of that building. And the rehabilitation is achieved through transferring materials from Chicago, from the building that he's kind of redeveloping in Chicago, to use the materials to rehabilitate this building, the Huguenot House in Kassel. And these are just some shots from the house as it operated during the run of the Documenta. And then after the Documenta ended, the materials that had been shipped from Chicago to Kassel, some of them were shipped back and then repackaged for the purposes of exhibition here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And in addition, that kind of circuit of, redeveloping property as part of investment in neighborhood, generating artistic works, relaying these through Documenta, and then relaying them back again through a museum, gallery, exhibition. And you see the installation shots there, you get a sense of the particular kind of grammar of exhibition that's being used. And then we have the Stony Island Arts Bank, this project of taking an old bank building and refunctioning it as an art institution, an institution of exhibition and display, but also an institution of kind of social investment. And so this is a kind of a positive kind of description of it. It's somebody kind of advocating for Gates's practice, saying that his achievement is to have moved social practice from being the do-gooder cousin of mainstream market-oriented art to its star attraction, something positively glamorous. The formula has made him perhaps the most powerful artist in America, commanding six-figure prices and applying his force of nature charisma to reshape a city. And so, this is part of the mediation of the practice, that it's operating not just within the contemporary art circuit, it's operating within local and city politics, it's operating within kind of economic redevelopment and urban planning. So it's and it's also at the same time as it's been picked up and championed within the mainstream kind of contemporary art press. So I'm going to move from Gates as example, which of course people have both valorized, championed, and also critiqued in terms of the way in which it sits within a kind of market operation, and also the way in which it sits within a particular tensions within the history of African-American political mobilizations in terms of the kind of the project of self-improvement through economic activity, which is something that goes right back to the immediate post-abolition period, as against work that places analysis more focused on questions of the structural racism. And so there's a kind of a tension between the idea, if you just get up and sort things out and the market can, you use the market, you use it intelligently and you leverage it for advantage, or you try and operate a question of the political, which in some way recognizes the limits of market relations as the driver of social relations. So I want to move from Theaster Gates to the work of Catherine Bohm. So Catherine Bohm is based...
Can I just sort of suggest that maybe I have sort of like 15 minutes left on this if we have a bit more sort of conversation as well, just so you've got your timing.
Okay, thanks, you're good. Yeah. So I'm close to finishing. So this example, trade show, Catherine Bohm, and so Catherine's practice is, highly, Catherine's practice has a number of key concerns, among them being the question of publicness, but also questions of spatial relations. In one of her projects, this is a co-curated show with Gavin Wade at Eastside Project called Trade Show. And Eastside Project is itself a kind of fascinating exhibitionary institution, which would warrant discussion in its own right. But just within this show, what happens is the exhibitionary space becomes simultaneously a space of trade. And so a whole range of different actors and agents operate in the gallery space as a live trading space. And this is part of Catherine's work in relation to the idea that economy is a public domain, not the economy of wage labor and capital, but rather the kind of submerged, hidden, invisible economy that's the necessary condition of possibility for that whole system of capital and wage labor to operate. And this diagram is a kind of encapsulation of that idea. And so this is trade as exchange that constitutes a space of publicness. Another example of Catherine's practice that's kind of relaying through the moment of exhibition, but also unfolding primarily in another space, is this collaborative project under the heading of My Villages, which is an ongoing project that involved a 2-year exhibitionary moment in Leipzig, centered around this building that's part of the museum complex. And we have assembled within the space of display and the kind of museum shop a whole range of materials and information that pertain to different villages around the world and different kind of local economies and local social infrastructures. And these are brought into relationship with each other through the dynamic of exhibition. And then just a third moment from Catherine's practice, and this is this incredible project, Company Drinks, which begins from a kind of folk memory of a form of temporary summer labor where people, working class people from the East End, went to counties like Kent to do summer harvesting of fruit and hops, and then often would bring some of these materials back with them to the East End and do some home brewing, distilling, making drinks and so forth. And so this was a kind of a cottage enterprise, as it were. And what Catherine has done is kind of built upon this history to elaborate a kind of community enterprise around the making of drinks. And so a big part of it is encapsulated in this drawing, which kind of maps the idea of economy as circulation. This is not economy as capitalization. So, and then there's this kind of interesting way in which Company Drinks operates. And one of its moments of kind of, I guess, kind of high visibility within the circuits of the art world is when Company Drinks operates a drink stall as part of the Frieze Fair. So Frieze Art Fair is kind of one of those, classic moments of the global art system that where the market is in full visibility. And then to have this kind of community enterprise situated within the circuit of Frieze, of course, creates certain questions about, what's going on. What are the relationships in play here? What exactly is transpiring? This last episode that I cite from Catherine's practice is work that she did last year, a project called When Decisions Become Art, that she did for the Kunstbunker in Nuremberg. And one of the first things that Catherine had done when she finished her undergrad was to set up Kunstbunker in Nuremberg. So she, as an early stage artist, was involved in organizing the infrastructure of exhibition. But then later, as her practice developed, it moved far beyond the terms of exhibition. But she's always kind of maintained an exhibitionary practice, but it just hasn't been the center of these practices. In this exhibition, then, we have a whole kind of exploration of self-organization. And so I just want to indicate that in this, one of the things that gets obscured in an overly dichotomous discussion of, gallery art and social practice or something like that, is the way in which the engagement of artists in the process of building the infrastructure of their practices, setting up studios, setting up publishing houses, setting up galleries, setting up, temporary exhibition moments, etc. That process of organizing the infrastructure of doing the art thing has created kind of extended versions of what an art practice can be. So instead of thinking, this attempt to deploy artistic practices as forms of social action is a kind of external imposition where somebody is taking art and instrumentalizing it, to rather see that actually one way of understanding this development is to see that in the enacting of artistic practices, in the setting up of studios, and so in setting up the means whereby to do the art thing, artists have ended up expanding the terms of their practice and recognizing the kind of social agency within the totality of their practice. And my colleague Jason E. Bowman in Gothenburg has done a lot of work in trying to map this relationship between building the infrastructure of practices and changing and extending the terms of practices. I'll just finish then with I'll rush through this. I just want to give you a sense of the work. So this is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the institution that was the basis of the institutional critique performance we saw earlier, the Jane Carlson docent lecture by Andrea Fraser. And Philadelphia, of course, is, again, like Chicago, highly segregated city. And also, it is one where there is a long history of state violence against the African American community. And of course, the institution, the Philadelphia Art Museum, would be, you know, it's the big White House on the hill. It's a center of a kind of dominant white elite culture. And so Janne van Heeswijk, a Dutch artist, was invited by the museum to, essentially, the idea was to have a kind of mid-career review of her practice, which also operates primarily outside of exhibition. But in terms of the invitation, she translated it into a kind of mapping of the kind of networks within the city. So she built contact with a whole range of activists, community organizers, all kinds of local enterprises and so forth, to try and propose that the museum would become a site where the different possible futures of Philadelphia would be assembled. And this kind of evolved through protocol where everybody working on the project was paid the same fee per hour. You know, there's a super detailed micro-organizational culture that goes into the implementing of this project over several years. And I'm just going to, these images, I won't talk you through them, but just give you a flavor of the volume and range of activity that unfolded over 4 years as the project kind of built itself. Culminating in a moment of exhibition. And here you see this mapping of the city's histories, multiple voices mapping multiple trajectories of the city, contradictory histories of the city. So the pastel colors there don't quite kind of set you up to recognize there's a deeply violent set of narratives unfold here, and these are contested narratives. And then just one detail, that in the cafe of the museum, they kind of displaced the corporate caterer and implemented a different kind of set of menus. It became a kind of part of the project. Immediately after finishing the Philadelphia Assembled project, which took about 4 or 5 years, Janne took another exhibitionary project on, which was with Bach in Utrecht. And again, I'm just going to give you some sense of the exhibitionary space, but the heading for this work was Trainings for the Not Yet, and essentially a proposition about the space of the exhibition becoming a space where people would organize and learn and train themselves in anticipation of a different future. So this Trainings for the Not Yet is a strategy of future anticipation, but it's not an avant-garde strategy of, you know, the I am the leader of the revolution and I speak the future, but rather this idea that from within a multiplicity of constituencies, different imaginings become operable, that there's some sense of not waiting for something to happen, but at the same time, not a naivety about what's possible. Again, there's this aspect of mapping. This is a work that comes from a project that Janne has been involved in her hometown of Rotterdam, where she's been working with Free House, this a community-based cooperative initiative that kind of combines building social infrastructure with commercial activity in the form of kind of small-scale sole traders, working in, again, a section of the city that's kind of segregated and subject to enormous kind of pressures for gentrification and to displace the existing populations. I just want to give you a sense of the exhibitionary space. So then very last and very quick is just to mention this project where the Van Abbe Museum attempted to kind of make itself over into this museum for art utile, this proposition from Tanya Bruguera, whereby the museum attempted to kind of make itself over as if it were capable of holding and archiving and becoming the museum of artistic practices which were premised on the operation of use, Stephen Wright's ideas about use, etc. So what did these examples do? I have, so Tiasta Gates, Catherine Bohm, Jana van Heeswijk, Tanya Bergera's the Van Abbe's Museum, Archie Teal. What these 4 examples I think do, they show us different ways in which different forms of socially embedded practices that often are built on long-term processes, both use exhibition and are also relayed through exhibition. And they all have different kind of problematics or questions we can ask about them. To Astor Gates, the question of the market, say with Jana, the question of the museum extending the invitation to a white European artist who then comes into the museum and becomes the one who extends the invitation to the immediate constituencies of the city who are excluded from the museum, de facto excluded just by a history of practice. So there's lots of different issues that we could discuss in relation to each of them. I'm more interested at the moment in just looking at them from this general question of what they might enable us to do to get past a particular impasse. And I would identify it with this debate that came out in the 2000s when Claire Bishop published this essay in Art Forum in 2006. And it kicked off a debate with Grant Kester, and it kind of set up an argument about the relationship between social practice, notions of the aesthetic, and questions about the relationships between ethics and art practice, and in a way that kind of echoes the debate that the Oliver Marchart piece sets out in terms of relationships between art and politics. And my proposition is, and this is ongoing work, so I'm wondering if the theoretical critical framing of a range of things like social practice, expanded, engaged, embedded, durational, art util, etc., the questions of self-organization. I'm wondering that critical and theoretical debate has tended to activate these kind of this well-established but somehow not so useful binaries. Is it aesthetics or is it politics? Is it art or is it direct action? Is this a critical practice or is this neoliberalism? Is this about autonomy or is this something that's totally institutionalized? And I just kind of think these terms are not so useful, particularly set up as these kind of cliched oppositions. And I'm wondering if that maybe the critical theoretical discourses are kind of out of step with the varieties and paradoxes of the practices. So it's not to say that the practices have resolved everything, but just to say that maybe they're inhabiting some new and more tricky and complex paradoxes that haven't yet really been talked through. And I'm wondering if it might be possible as one strategy to look closely at the specific dynamics of practices that operate different relays between the exhibitionary moment and other moments of operation. That I'm wondering if that might be one possible way to start to reframe these debates. And that's pretty much what I had to present, but I was hoping that maybe to kind of concretize this a little bit in terms of where everybody is positioned, that maybe in the discussion, if you are interested, that these might be questions that we could do in the breakout groups, which is basically to start and consider how exhibition might or might not be something that you use within your practice. And to also consider maybe the different ways in which exhibitions might operate in relation to not just this spectrum of socially embedded practices, but also maybe other things like, research practices that do not so easily translate themselves into moments of spectacle or moments of display. And then this is something that haunts me, are there practices which fundamentally cannot operate or be realized through the logics of exhibition without being radically distorted? And you'd somehow in the act of being, so in the act of showing them, you somehow destroy them or make them invisible. Does that relationship hold for some practices? But those were questions I thought might be useful for the breakout session if you're interested. But that was what I had to share with you. I hope there was something of use in it. Thanks.
That's fantastic, Mick. Thank you very much. And I'm sure we can have some thumbs up and silent rounds of applause from everyone that's here. So yeah, cheers. I mean, as always, really insightful, very rich, plenty of really practical, useful information in there, as well as kind of, I think, the generosity around kind of presenting some of those questions at the end as, thinking in progress. I always think it's a lovely thing that you're offering us there to sort of engage in that. And I think that sort of invitation at the end to say, well, actually, perhaps it is the practice that is driving the kind of the theory here, and kind of the way of framing the sort of things that we're doing is learned through doing them, as much as it is about sort of looking for those, perhaps still useful to kind of reflect on some of those debates that you've brought up and kind of understand them, but as kind of things that we need to get over, or we can sort of move through to avoid some of these impasses that you've mentioned. So, I mean, just kind of picking up on some of the comments that we've got in the chat, there's some just practical stuff about, are we able to get copies of the slides? Because obviously there's plenty of information in there. If you're able, we've recorded this presentation as well, so you'll be able to go back into it and watch it in that way. And some specific things about, I guess, moments in some of the stuff that you're bringing up, just about this kind of, I mean, there was quite a lot in there, Mick, but there's sort of, to look at that sort of first section around the kind of almost the rush to move online, and kind of the almost uncritical potential embrace of digitizing a lot of kind of, I mean, practice that, they were exhibitions that were going to happen, and it was immediately like, right, okay, how do we sort of turn this round into the space that whatever Google or whoever else might offer to us, without really necessarily thinking that through entirely. So I think we've got a couple of comments from Alice and Sarah about, I guess, thinking about the and Ida as well, thinking about the the problematics of that, just in terms of the I guess who owns that space, and kind of like whether digital space like that is public space in the same way as I don't know, art spaces might be. I mean,
I think just reading the chat there, like, so there is this sense, okay, well, there are these global infrastructures of Instagram, Facebook, email, and that the idea of opting out, which some people have pursued, they have sought to go off the grid, to refuse to have a digital presence, etc. But again, I don't think it needs to be presented to us as the question, oh, well, are you going to use it or not use it? It's more just recognizing it is part of the conditions we're in. So it is a set of conditions that has emerged relatively recently, is still subject, it's still emerging, it's still changing. And that, I guess the thing is to in some way just not take it as given, but to understand that it's something to be problematized. And one of the things that we can see is that it's doing something to the terms of public discourse. And one of the things that it's doing is it's kind of creating a particular culture of, people use the term, the alt-right uses the term virtue signaling. But we don't have to pursue the alt-right position on this, but we can recognize that there's something about performing, announcing values and positions and pushing them out in a way that it is very kind of profoundly disconnected from what's actually happening. So, announcing all these values, but then doing something that's somehow disconnected from them. Now, this has always been a dimension of public discourse, that people perform and say stuff and then maybe enact other behaviors. But there's something about the intensification of that disjunct. And there's also something about the sense that utterance as such is becoming emptied. and the extreme versions of that being notions like fake news, etc., where any form of utterance is immediately evacuated. So what does this mean? I don't think it comes back to, well, will I have a Facebook account or not? I mean, you can take it at that level, and that is one level to consider. But even if I'm not on Facebook, Facebook is operating and is shaping the conditions in which we operate. These social media platforms are clearly, one of the major sites of contestation. They have transformed social and political relations, but they also are continuing things. It's not all just new and rupture. Some of it continues certain things from the past. So again, to not jump into a straight, are you for it or against it, and rather try and find a way to problematize and think it, and find pathways to act, thinking it rather than accepting the dichotomy that's presented to us. Are you for it or against it? Or there's no choice. You have no choice. That these they're too simplified. They're too quick. We should automatically be a little bit suspicious.
Thanks, Mick. That's great. And I'm just kind of keeping an eye on any other sort of questions that might come through. I mean, obviously you've given us a great sort of historical account there, kind of where some of the moment that we're at thinking about exhibition social practices has come from. But I think Ida had just asked a very specific question about where that kind of art and politics dichotomy, what the root might be of the first instance of it. I mean, kind of where would you start with that when you're kind of doing your course? What was the first time someone considered those two things together?
Well, there isn't a, I don't think there is a classic, here's where it all begins. I think that the way I approach this in the course is I say, okay, there's a number of different ways of thinking what politics is. Politics is Trump arguing about the election results, or politics is what is happening in terms of the global distribution of toxins and of the impacts of climate. We can look at it in all kinds of different ways. There's lots of different ways of construing what politics is. Similarly, art can mean European art with a capital A after Immanuel Kant and that thing, or it can mean a whole range of other things. And then this question of politics and art becomes not about the definite relationship between two well-defined objects, but rather it becomes a question about how two contested sites, art, politics, might be understood through each other, and that there are multiple ways in which they have relationship, and that maybe we can get beyond talking about a relationship between two separate moments if we think through these oppositions by looking at concrete instances. So I don't have a theory of art and politics, but rather an exercise of looking at concrete instances where questions of the political and questions of art are somehow embroiled in each other, and where the contestation of both is in play. This is very unsatisfying in one sense, because it's like, well, would you just answer the question? It doesn't allow you to do that. But what it does allow you to do is maybe pay attention to concrete instances as the basis of thinking, rather than producing a grand pronouncement. Art has always been this. Politics is about, to avoid those rushes to summarize the complexity of our experiences into too quick and too sharp a reduction. But so the best I could maybe offer on that is that I will send a link through Andy to where the slides that I showed you can be accessed, and with it I'll include some of the material that we share for the course, just so the reading materials that we use, which I emphasize is a mapping of lots of different conjunctions rather than a theory of art and politics.
That's great, Mick. Thank you. I can see some appreciative nods there from everyone else as well. So people love to have that. So, I mean, I kind of wanted to, sort of maybe pick up on something that's maybe in between the reading that was sent out, the Oliver Marche thing, and this presentation that we've given now, which is I mean, the language that you bring into this is really very useful for us all. I'm thinking about, you know, the exhibitionary moment, and the, you know, rather than the kind of the exhibition, which is tended to be, you know, classically thought of as the thing that we're moving towards the final piece. But yeah, whether these kind of practices have their moments of kind of visibility and kind of what is the, I mean, yeah, the group will get to sort of discuss this in the breakouts, but what are the benefits that are kind of offered by having that exhibitionary moment, and maybe some of the complications that they bring in as well. But there's something really nice in that text that you sent out about the kind of yeah, I mean, not a binary, but a kind of like a conversation between clarity and complexity, or simplicity and complexity. And so really thinking about often how maybe, I don't know, exhibitions are seen as the moment where it might start to make these practices more, or add in readings that you might not have seen through the kind of direct, concrete social activity that's happening, that somehow they become more sophisticated by being brought into a gallery space or even an art world discourse than just, oh, it's someone doing a food bank. It's kind of like, you know, if it's someone kind of like, yeah, doing a social direct action in the normal world, then that's too simple. But when it comes into the art space, suddenly it's, you know, endowed with all the kind of complexity and richness that somehow makes it art. And I think the way that you've kind of talked about some of this stuff is saying, well, no, maybe the exhibition is, you know, a reversal of that, where it becomes almost like a sort of taking a slice of something that in the world is very complicated and very rich as it is, and kind of, you know, almost like making it, I don't know, more simple, or kind of offering a simple expression of this kind of complicated project through the exhibition. I thought was kind of, I don't know, I got through those two bits, but I mean, what are your thoughts on this kind of, yeah, whether do these projects that are very rich need to be presented in their complexity? You know, what happens when they're kind of simplified?
Well, I guess I think the thing that I'm trying to work through at the moment, that kind of approaching this, is to think of the moment of exhibition as not just a moment of a kind of, you know, somebody has a message, they send the message, and somebody else receives the message. You know, and I think this is an interesting. I would say that the 1980s and 1990s contemporary art discourse tended to be dominated by kind of politics of representation. Who is speaking? Who are they speaking to? How is the message encoded? Those became and then with the kind of turn to, on the one hand, people like Rancière, and on the other hand, people like Deleuze, what happens is there's a kind of a refocusing to the question of the way in which stuff has agency outside the terms of representation. And so what I'm getting at is that to think of exhibition maybe not as a moment when something is represented, but to think of exhibition as possibly a moment when something is enacted, something is operated. So to move from the idea of telling a story or showing something to the idea of an operation happening. And I'm not saying that this is the truth, or this is the only way to do it, but I'm saying there's an interesting shift that happens then. And I'm kind of drawing a lot here from recent conversations with Catherine Bohm, where she's talking about this idea of a kind of one-to-one operation, where the exhibition is not showing something, but is doing the thing that it seems to be about. So instead of a representation of, there is a moment of the operation of. So instead of a show about self-organization, there's an unfolding of self-organizing activities within a moment of display. And so this might be a way to allow that complexity every moment is equally complex. Every moment is equally dense. Now there's this other thing that keeps coming back in, and it's just, you know, the difference between, like, I pick up this piece of paper and I stick it to the wall with a bit of sellotape, or I take, you know, a fabulously finished Cibachrome thing, and it's framed, it's mounted, and I place it on the wall with invisible fixtures, and it looks like God put it on the wall. You know, that and those differences matter in some way. They do something. And they don't just matter as, okay, one is a sign of value and one is a sign of less value. It's a little bit more tricky than that, but it does matter. And so, I mean, I think, you know, part of say the Theaster Gates work, it's really interesting that what happens when he takes the bits of the old buildings to recirculate them is that he activates a language of formalism, of, you know, late 20th century American abstraction. And the works have a particular formal vocabulary that is familiar to the kind of standard museum goer. Now, I'm not saying that that's a virtue, but what I'm trying to point to is that in the process of exhibition, the agency of material, the agency of stuff, in terms other than just representation, I think this is something that we have to keep in play. And I guess this is what I was trying to criticize, I guess, in the rush to shove all this stuff online, is that museums who've been telling us for years that they're about spatial relations, they're about the density of the kind of encounter with stuff in space with others, kind of abandon all that rhetoric and just go, no, it's about getting the stuff out there and making sure we get a number of clicks and a number that we're visible. And I think, okay, do we have to take our own critical discourses serious or not? Do we have to pay attention to what we're saying and follow them through, or can we just say any old stuff and change our mind in the morning because we've been in shutdown or something? So I think there's something about, this is a difficult thing about, and you know, this is a difficult obligation on everyone, and I don't have this. It's the consistency of our ways of talking with what we're doing, and there's a real strong tendency for us to disconnect what we're saying from what we're actually doing. And so I have to go back and say, okay, what I've just shared now, how does that pertain to the fact that I'm doing it within this Zoom room? It's within the context of the invitation from Unidee. You know, there's a whole set of relations in the background and so forth. Like, you know, this is also inside the reputational economy. It's all, you know, there's all those things. So it's not, I don't have to claim a pure position outside looking in, but I do have to pay attention to what am I saying? Does it have any entailment or consequences for where I'm saying it, how I'm saying it, and what I say next? Do obligations arise because of saying, announcing a particular commitment, belief, or critique? And I think this is what I finish on this. It's just, I think what I find very interesting is, say, the project by Grant Kester in this journal Field, where he talks about a socially engaged art criticism, where the idea that instead of producing an art critic's pronouncement on the work, there is this idea of being entangled and embedded within a shared collaborative project, which doesn't become uncritical because of collaboration, but rather the critical process operates slightly differently than just announcing my position and what I believe. It becomes a question of being less sovereign, less self-sufficient, but nonetheless still having to give an account of oneself. And you can hear that I haven't got this resolved, but what I'm trying to get at is there is no getting away from the complexity. And there might be a need to not stay just within the terms of a politics of representation, but try to think about the different agencies in play besides representation. Not to say that that doesn't matter, but that to say that's not the only game in town.
Thanks, Mick.
I'm
That's
now
good.
babbling.
No, it's good to have it's always nice to sort of be part of that process as well. So I'm going to sort of suggest that we have like 2 minutes more, and so you can still have a 10-minute break, because there's obviously loads to sort of talk through here, and maybe just pick up on this question that Tatiana's put about, I mean, the audience, I suppose, kind of maybe their expectations around kind of coming to spaces where the representational is how you engage with those places, and how you might sort of enable a different understanding from. Just give us a nod, Tatiana, about you thinking more about the audience that come and experience these projects, and the kind of the shift that they might have to make, the distance they have to cover to get to grips with coming into an exhibition space that is a workshop rather than seeing kind of the art. I mean, is that something you've dealt with as a curator, Mick, or kind of with the artists that you're working with, the kind of what the expectation from the audience on these things, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. The like, if you look at those two early examples, like of the museum in Rio with the Sundays of Creation, and the Moderna Museum in Stockholm with the model, that the 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 mode of address to the audience is to say, come and enact something, do something, engage in some process, and something opens out. Now, there's been a huge wave of critique of this, of saying that this is a kind of, inviting people into the space of play, which, it kind of animates a space of public activity, but empties it of actual content or meaning, and it just becomes a question of distraction, the spectacle, etc. But on the other hand, if we think through, say, something like Philadelphia Assembled, where Jana van Heeswijk spends this period of 4 years, makes contact, meets somebody, says, tell me who you think I should meet, and then out of that solicits an engagement with a shared project where the framework, the content, the themes come out of those dynamics and are not authored by someone at the center, but there's definitely agency at the center conditioning this. But on the other hand, there's something that emerges which does not represent a kind of a signature action by the author, but something emerges which is in terms of a different set of relations, so that when one goes into the gallery to see, say, the move documentation of the Philadelphia police force aerially bombing a commune, then you are speaking to somebody who was part of that commune, who was in prison for many decades. So that encounter is it's a much more, it's multiple, it's variable, and there's a sense of being owner going into the space rather than audience going in to be entertained. And so I'm not saying that these participatory modes solve everything, and I'm not ignoring the very important critiques of the way in which participation has functioned as a kind of co-option. But I'm saying we do have, if we look at these concrete examples, you start to see, here's an institution that its forms of display is now dealing with multiple constituencies. It's not just the white middle class, college educated. It now, there's multiple users of this space, and they are using that space in a way that is integrated into their everyday, and in a way that is retroacting on the space, so that the space's program is being modified, impacted by these new user groups. And I think there's got to be something interesting to explore further there. But I don't see that the project here is to redeem the museum or redeem the exhibition. That's not my motivation, but it's rather to say, okay, these things are happening. Can we learn something from them? Can they somehow get us past some of these impasses of is it art or is it politics? Is it art or is it social work? These kinds of.
I think that's fantastic, Mick, and I think worth sort of spending the extra time on. So, I mean, there's definitely a really good setup now there for you to be doing the group discussions and kind of lots to think through. We'll obviously paste the prompts that Mick has kind of come up with as well into the chat, and I'll put that screen up after the break so you can see it. But just to say that you can have 10 minutes now. I mean, I really think, Mick, to kind of, if we were to, because I know the group discussions have always been very rich and kind of this is a very thoughtful group that like to come and address every little bit. But I would say that invitation that you've made there to sort of really think about the concrete specificity of the exhibition moment or the exhibition kind of form related to your practices, I think would be a great way to think through it, because it's not kind of to think, okay, in general, how do I think they're kind of interesting questions, but I think the opportunity you've got here is to really think, well, in terms of what you've been developing or working on over the last few weeks, really, how could it be useful for you or not, or what are the challenges there to think about? Because it's kind of, I think we are at a point now where it's kind of, well, it's not just a complete assumption that you have to have the exhibition at the end. And obviously I'll be talking about our sort of in-between way of doing that with this residency afterwards. But let's take 10 minutes. Thank you again, Mick. Like really,
Thank you. Sorry for talking too much.
Never. And I think we're getting some really good sharing of comments and resources in the chat as well, so we'll make sure that we share that. So thank you to everyone for contributing there. So if we come back for 5:30, and we'll have those questions ready, and that kind of gives you 7 minutes or so to kind of like have a quick break and get a drink, and we'll then have good time for the conversation. So see you